Good evening, and welcome to our second October webinar, The College Transition Through the Lens of Mental Health. I'm Valerie Barton. I'm the Executive Director of the Youth Mental Health Project, and I'm so excited this evening to be joined by Gregg Pauletti. Gregg is the founder and director of the RCHI Group, which is a mental health consultancy that works exclusively with students who are transitioning to college and who have mental health challenges. So unfortunately, Paul Barger had a family emergency and he was not able to join us this evening, but we are in good hands with Gregg. One announcement is that we are going to be holding plenty of time at the end of this presentation for people to ask questions. We expect that there will be quite a few that come up. So feel free to drop your questions into the chat box and we will work through those in the latter part of the hour together. So the transition to college, I mean, we're all here because the transition to college is a big one for students and parents. And for students with mental health challenges, this is made even more complex. So it's not just sufficient to find a school that's a good academic fit and social fit for your student, but it's also really important to find a school that has the mental health supports that your child specifically needs. And so I want to welcome Gregg and thank you so much for being here. I've been really looking forward to this conversation this evening.
Thank you, Valerie. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm looking forward to kind of sharing what my world is, working with young adults and students, as well as the families, and hoping that we can have a really rich discussion and help all the attendees learn a thing or two, but also maybe be reinforce some of the things they've already learned and help one another. So I appreciate the invitation and being here. I'll just take a minute and just share a little bit about myself and my background. I founded RCHI Group a number of years ago because I found that there was this gap in the services provided between the higher education world and the mental health world. My background, I started my career in higher education and admissions, and then went into the counseling and mental health world. I have a master's in clinical mental health counseling, and worked in the nonprofit world for quite a while, specifically with young adults in their transition into college. And then, like as I mentioned a few years ago, I started RCHI Group to really pinpoint and work with families in this transition. And one thing that, as I've been working with families and young adults, I've come across is that not every school is created equal, right? When it comes to mental health, nearly every school will have mental health services. I'm not saying that, and all the schools, I should say, a majority of the schools have student support services, as they're required to by the ADA, but they're not created equal at all. And what our RCHI Group has done is kind of gone through and ranked these schools. And unfortunately, there are about 24 schools that do a good job, I would say good job at supporting students who have mental health concerns. The rest, they have the resources, but they don't necessarily have the support. And I think that's a pretty big distinction that we have found and that we work with families to figure out and navigate. And normally, the chances of any one student going to the 24 or so schools that we think are really excellent in terms of mental health supports is relatively low depending on where they're located. So we really specialize in helping build out those supports on the school that they've chosen if they're not already there. So mental health, as everyone who's on this webinar knows, is really important and is becoming an area that people are paying attention to now. And it's not just like the acute cases where a person or a student needs a session or two on campus. It's the young adults and students who need a semester's worth or a year's worth or more than 1 year worth of mental health treatment or support while on campus, or other wellness supports. And so how do we figure out how to make that happen for those families and students?
So
So that's yeah, go ahead.
go ahead. So I was just going to say, I wanted to kind of start broad and provide some context, and then kind of drill down into some really practical sorts of questions to leave
Yeah.
parents at the end of this call with some tools that they can use to help navigate this process. So based on the experience that you just described and your kind of years in this area, um, over the past 10 years or so, what have you observed about what you're seeing in colleges generally with respect to mental health services and supports? What's changed? What hasn't? And as a parent, you know, well, I should say first, like how, if any way, has this changed because of the pandemic?
So those are great questions, Valerie. So I guess the first part of that is, what's changed? And unfortunately, having mental health crises, that's always been around, but that's becoming more frequent, right? A quarter of students on college campuses will experience a mental health crises or episodes at some point while they're in school. So that's a big deal. And schools are fortunately now they're recognizing that and trying to build out their supports. Um, Not that they didn't have any supports before, but now it's becoming so frequent that they have to beef them up, and they're putting the money into it, and they're doing a great job. Um, the difference, I guess, in the problem is that those supports, as I alluded to a few minutes ago, are focused on acute supports. Being able to have therapists and counselors at the ready when a student walks through that wellness center door or that counseling center door, and being able to give them a session, and not have to wait weeks or months for it. Because unfortunately, that's what was happening. In So now it might be a little bit better on that side. But with the students that we work with, and I think that maybe a lot of the families that are on here tonight, having that acute is great, but they really need, or those families and students really need something that can be more long term, and that's where schools are falling short. And that's sometimes by choice. They don't want to be the mental health treatment, right? They don't want to have that, to be that aspect of the student's life. Um, I don't necessarily agree with that sentiment. I think that if you're going to have students live and be in that world for as long as they are, that should come, be part of the package. Because wellness and mental health is so important during this phase of a young adult's life. Um, so I don't know if I answered that completely. I think I did. The last part of your question about COVID, and I don't think it's going to come as a surprise, and that's just exacerbating everything. The rates of depression and anxiety have skyrocketed. Isolating in dorm rooms is becoming a major issue. Students, in the early part were locked down. They literally couldn't leave their dorm rooms in many cases, and so that obviously created many issues. Depending on the area of the country where you lived, it might be better or worse. So we were working with students in both aspects of that. But COVID really threw a wrench in mental health, or mental wellness, I guess is the best way to say it.
And
Uh,
has the pandemic accelerated colleges' investments in mental health services in any way? Like, have they sort of shifted their resources and built out more quickly to be able to handle the increased pressures that the students are under?
I want to say yes, but my feeling in what I'm seeing is really not really. I mean, the there was a reaction, right? And we all experienced this, the reaction to COVID and being locked down and having, this, um, really huge problem on their plates. And they pumped money into the health aspect, right? The testing and the kind of making sure everything was safe. And mental health was a part of that. But as far as the long-term plan to like build up the resources, I don't see that as being a major part in what they've been doing. Some schools have done a pretty good job in making sure the supports are there, but by and large, unfortunately, I don't believe that's been happening.
So how do parents know? So you're, like, I guess, uh, you go on tours and you look at websites and you see the schools saying certain things and they're saying the right things. How
Yeah.
do you know as a parent whether the school that your child is really excited about is paying lip service to doing this, or if they actually have the supports? Because when you take these tours and things, they're going to say what they think that you want to hear. So is there anything that would, that parents should ask on the tours, or should they, how do you actually get under the hood to find that out?
That's a great question, and you're exactly right. When you go on a tour or you go into that information session, the school puts out their best foot forward, right? They tell you everything that all the great things that they've been doing, and they show you the great things that they've been building. Um, I've been on one tour where they've shown us the counseling center, um, and if mental health is on and student support services are on your radar as something that you need to be looking at for your student, then more often than not you have to ask to see it. And when you do ask to see it, they probably will say, well, okay, we'll go through the tour, and then when we get back to the admissions or whatever, then we'll find someone that can take you there, and then may just drop you off, and then you kind of are left to your own devices. It's not a big part of their delivery during the admissions process or the tour process. What we do is I do exactly what I just said. I don't, well, I do the tours, but then I pay special attention, and I do a secondary visit specifically to the support services into the counseling center, and I speak with the director of the counseling services or the wellness services, and try to get a really firm understanding of exactly what services they offer and how they offer it and when they offer them, and try to get to know them a little bit. And if I'm telling the parents right now what they should be doing, it's exactly that. It's make the expectation when you go to see a school to, yeah, do the tour, see the athletic facilities, see the wellness center, see the student center, get an idea of what the feel of the school is all about, because that's really important. But make sure you stick around, and or before you leave campus, you know, you meet with those counseling center and student support services, have their email, send them an email before you get there and say, hey, well, I'm going to be on campus on such and such day. Is there going to be someone there to answer questions or that I can meet with? The other really big part of this is, unfortunately, parents have weekends, right, to visit schools. If at all possible, visit during the week. I think that's a really important thing, because that's when most of those staff and those centers are going to be available for something like that. Um, so if they can try to meet them during the week and have them as a separate meeting to that tour, that's always the best thing.
So, and it's not, so just to reassure parents that it's, what you're saying is that it's not, that if make that outreach and you say, I want to meet with the people in the support services, and, you can sort of sense whether whether a school is open to that and resistant, or, you know what I mean? Like, it
Yeah.
feels to me that as a parent, I would be like, okay, if they're not like, sure, absolutely, I'm happy to meet with you. And this is when we can, if they're not available, I would probably read something negative into that, right?
Yeah, the biggest, I'm so glad you said that, Valerie. The biggest tell, if that's what we want to call it, right, is if they have like business cards of the counseling center in the admissions office, like, ready, like, hold on a second, I'll go get you admissions cards. This is who you can speak to. If that's there and ready for you, that's a pretty good understanding of, like, the quality or the level of support that they're ready to give you. If those business cards or that contact person isn't, like, ready at hand, um, then make sure you do a little more homework.
Got it. Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
So I guess, are there additional questions? I mean, again, I want to get really tactical now. Are there additional questions um, that they should be asking when they meet with that admissions? Say they get through, and then the person says, "Oh yeah, absolutely, we'll connect you, with this person," and or they'll come out and meet with you. What are like 3 or 4 questions that parents should ask when they get that second, more focused meeting?
Yeah. So the number one question that I would make sure that they ask is, if they're going to be if the student is going to be seen at the counseling center, how many sessions do they get? Um, you know, Oftentimes schools have a limit on the number of times they can be seen in a semester or in a year, and they need to figure out that number. If it's one or two, then a backup plan needs to be created, obviously. Meaning in that backup plan usually will involve like finding a therapist nearby campus, or in the city if it's in a city. But something else needs to kind of be put in place to make sure that if they need that support, they can access it. The other thing is, the other question they need to ask is, what's the wait time? If a student, is having a problem on a Friday evening, there'll probably be like an emergency number or call number that they can access. But how quickly can they be seen by someone on campus? In the height of COVID, I heard some horror stories, and they were like months before a student could be seen. And it's like, oh, wait a second, this isn't going to work. For a student who's in distress, or maybe even mildly in distress, weeks or months is not appropriate. So figure out what that wait time is. Again, if the counseling center staff, they probably won't advertise, oh yeah, it took 3 weeks for us to get to be seen. So that's going to be a little harder to figure out. Students usually know. So if there are students nearby, or if they know a student at a campus, usually that is a pretty good way to figure out that information. So I would use that as a parent. Students, actually, this isn't a complete aside for a moment, Valerie, but if a family or students have access to current students, they're rich with information. So always use them to get the real information about anything on campus, but especially about services like this. They usually have a really good they have a pulse on the situation.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
I just want to pause for a second and reiterate that if there are questions that people have, to add them into the chat box, because we are going to be doing some Q&A later on in the conversation. So when, why, and how should students seek special accommodations? And are there situations when they shouldn't?
Yeah, so the when is absolutely, if accommodations were being received in high school, then don't even hesitate to make sure those accommodations are at least attempted to be put in place in college. The process of that is very, very different, because the responsibility shifts from the teachers and the administrators and the family to putting those accommodations in place in high school, to the young adult, the student, to actually making sure those accommodations are put in place in college. And not only just put in place initially, but then has to be renewed every semester. So the whole process is very different. So again, if they're in place in high school, then they should be put in place in college. The other time when they should be put in place in college is if there's even a hint of maybe something that might be needed. I would err on the side of caution, right? One example of this is, maybe there is academically the student is great. There's no need for like special support services. Even maybe anxiety or depression is low. I'm just using anxiety, depression as an example. And they've never really needed extra time or a separate place to do schoolwork or tests or anything like that. But there's a possibility that when they're on campus that they may need that, or maybe that they're just going to need more support in general. I would definitely move to try and have that. Just because accommodations are put in place doesn't necessarily mean that the student has to use them. Oftentimes we'll work with families and students to put accommodations in place as a safety net. So let's say something happens in the middle of a semester or an exam time or something, and the student has to leave campus for whatever reason and can't continue that semester. Those accommodations are a really, really important piece of the process in order to get a medical withdrawal or something similar to that. So to make sure that that slip up or that somewhat of a minor problem doesn't turn into a gigantic problem where the school flunks every class that student had and the GPA plummets, and it snowballs into a major issue. So having accommodations in place is kind of an indication to the school that, hey, there's something here. We need to make sure we support this student. And and then for the family, they can actually kind of pick up the pieces and make sure that student has a soft landing and not such a major issue.
So I want to follow up on something you alluded to earlier. Suppose a student, you know, that their mindset, your child says, I've been dealing with my mental health issues for a long time. I've got a handle on them. I'm turning over a new leaf when I go to college. I don't want to disclose anything. I just want to be an independent adult and do this on my own. And so they don't get those accommodations put in place, right?
Yeah.
And then they need help. Is there a recourse if they get into their freshman year or the end of their freshman year where they say, I really can't do it. I really do need those accommodations. Do schools look, do they look unfavorably upon that and realize and think, well, they should have said this earlier on? Or is there an opportunity all along the line for kids to maybe try it without those accommodations and then get them put in place later?
Two wonderful questions. The first part of this is, should they feel like if they ask for accommodations, right, that they're looked at differently by the school? And the answer to that is absolutely not. The accommodations in the disclosure is only to that particular office that provides those accommodations. That office is not allowed to share that with any other part of the university, as far as why that student is needing those accommodations. So I think that's really important. So if the student and the family, maybe there is, let's say major depression or major anxiety, and they need a separate room for test taking. The only thing that the professor will know that they need is a separate room for test taking. The professor does not need to know and will not know why they need that separate room. Just that when it comes upon exam time, that student, John needs to go, and they go, and that's where they take their test, and that's the end of it. There's a larger question here, and that is, should that student disclose to the professor or to other parties? And that's more tricky, because not just should you disclose, but like how much to disclose. And sometimes students aren't comfortable saying anything to professors, other than maybe there's a medical. Oftentimes we'll coach and say, you can say there's a medical situation or medical problem. Mental health can be considered a medical problem. They're not lying. They're not making things up. And if that's what they're comfortable, that's okay. That being said, when you're being honest and open with the professor, sometimes that professor is a little more understanding if they turn in something late, or if they're late to class for a number of times, or something like that. And sometimes when you disclose and let that professor know, and you build that personal relationship with them, it is to the student's advantage to let them know a little bit more about what's going on. It's really case by case, so it's hard to say. So I think I answered both those parts of the questions, right, Valerie? So it's the information isn't disclosed to anyone, right, unless that student or family wants to. And as far as like getting accommodations, actually I should say, you can't actually get accommodations unless you provide the necessary paperwork showing that you need them. So that office is going to know whatever it is that's going on that actually confirms the mental health diagnosis or the learning disability, or whatever the case is.
So if you find yourself in a position where your student doesn't want to disclose at admission, and they say later on they want it, then the school is going to work with them. The school should be able to work with them later and not say, oh, you didn't disclose this at the application time, and so you can't get them. Right?
Oh, I didn't even talk about admission, and that's a whole nother story, right?
I think that's the wondering part, is like, do you disclose, do you not disclose? Like, you want your kid to be at a place where they, where their needs are met, and you want to be partners with it. But then on the other hand, you want to be, maintain their privacy and their control as young adults. And so I guess there's that balance of how parents guide their student if their student is resisting it,
Right.
And then that question of if the kid puts their foot down and says, nope, I don't want them to start with, can they go back then and get them later?
So the student can always go back and get them later. So let's just stay there. That is always on the table. The only time that is a little more tricky is if it's literally in the middle of a semester and the student says, no, I need extra time, or I need a separate space, and the semester is halfway through. I doubt any school will do that, because all the schools hang on this phrase, reasonable accommodations, and they're probably going to say, no, it's not reasonable for us to make this happen in the middle of a semester. Some schools will do better than others, but I don't think I've ever seen a school in the middle of a semester say, oh yeah, absolutely, we can make sure that happens. Normally accommodations need to be done prior to the semester starting, or in those first week or two. The issue of admission, though, is something that is, I'm sorry, I should have said that early on, right? That is actually a much harder question to answer, because schools read the application, right? And they don't necessarily have to give a reason for denial, and whether or not they admit it. If they see a mental health consideration, they may see that as a liability, and they may see that as like, you know what, we're not gonna take this on. So you never have to disclose on your application for admission anything as far as mental health is concerned. I say you never have to. Sometimes it is to a student's advantage to do so, in order to explain what happened sophomore year in high school, right? Maybe they missed a lot of school, or maybe they had to go, away to a therapeutic program or something like that. And sometimes it's needed to disclose, to say, this is what happened, and the way and we work with this all the time, right? The best way to work with that is to demonstrate change, right? So sophomore year, freshman year, even junior year, something happened. When you can demonstrate that, okay, so something happened, they went, got help, got treatment, did whatever for however long, and then you can demonstrate that they were successful afterwards, and they are working, or they're back in school, or they're getting great grades, or whatever the case is afterwards. Being able to show that they're now a different young man or young woman, or now that they have been able to gain skills and strategies to cope with whatever they're living with. That is the most important piece of that's where that supplemental information on the application is really important. Again, there are degrees in which you can disclose, and that is different, that is individualized for every student. I've never had obviously we never say the same thing with every student, so you have to really take it case by case.
But it's not the case that you have to disclose before, like during the application process. You can disclose and get the accommodations after. But I
Yeah.
guess, one thing is, in trying to figure out what the right fit is for your kid, there is an argument to be made for sort of, kind of disclosing that during the application process, because any school that would deny a student because of that is probably not going to be set up to provide them what they need. Or is that right, or no?
That is exactly right. Yeah. In most cases, not all cases, but I think that, so the transcripts tell a story also, right? And we have to understand this. So if a student is taking you know alternative type classes, and it's shown on the transcript, well, okay, so you might want to explain why that student is in those classes, and you're going to probably need to, otherwise there's going to be holes in that application, and the admissions counselors are going to wonder and want to figure out what's going on there, and they might even ask for additional information before they make a decision. But yeah, as far as schools are concerned, if they normally you're going to want to figure out prior to doing the application, and trying to get admitted to that school, what kind of supports are there and what that actually looks like, because if they I hate to, I don't want to single out any one particular school, but there's a group of schools in our country that are highly selective, and are from an admission standpoint, really, really tricky in disclosing anything about mental health, because the moment you do, it becomes much more difficult in gaining admission.
I want to circle back. I want to really take a deep dive in a minute on IEPs and 504s and this kind of thing and how that looks. But one thing you said before triggered a question, which is the interaction of the student with the professor.
Hmm.
And what does a student do? Like, what does a student do if they, so the professor gets a list of people who have accommodations in their classes, they know who they are. What if a professor's just like, yeah, I don't do accommodations. This isn't what I do. Right. And the student has to navigate that with the teacher when there's this power imbalance between the two of them.
Yeah, that is a great question. I think it's really important for parents to know that the Office of Accommodations or Student Services or Student Support, whatever every school's different, they call it something different. They are they're making the initial contact with that professor. So the student doesn't necessarily have to do anything other than make sure that that one office knows that they need accommodations. And then that office will send an email or a letter or whatever to the professor saying, this student needs, extra time or needs a separate room. And then that professor in that office will discuss what's reasonable for that particular class. Maybe it's like a chemistry lab, and it's not reasonable to have a separate room to do a chemistry lab, right? Because they need to be in the specialized with the specialized equipment. So that professor might say, well, this is our option, and then that student, maybe the office will tell the student what's going on, or the three of them can then discuss, all right, so maybe there's an alternative time they can do the test or something to that case. Very rarely has a professor just said, nope, can't do it all. Mostly because accommodations aren't like, they have to do something. It's not really a choice. When a student receives accommodations, they've documented why they need them, and that's protected under the ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act. So schools have to abide by that. So it's just how the degree in which they do that, it becomes the kicker. The professors, like to use the chemistry example, they might have to do something in an alternative way other than what's exactly requested, but typically they will do whatever they can to help that student.
So the student needs to know. So the student needs to know going in, because they do have to kind of own this process and own the success on a day-to-day basis. The parents aren't going to be there. So it's good for the students then to know that, if there's a professor who's being difficult, you have a place to go to get this adjudicated.
Yes, absolutely. Actually, that's the biggest part of this, right? When I first started, the responsibility shifts to the student in this process, and they should become very friendly with like the director of that office, right? And make sure that they know that what the student's needs are, and the student needs to advocate for themselves, to be able to say, listen, like, this isn't working for me. Can we figure something else out? And more often than not, they will try to work with the student.
Okay, so let's talk about the special services process. And, most of the parents probably on this call have navigated the 504 and IEP processes in elementary, middle school, or high school. How, if at all, is this process different in college? And can you define what special services means in the context of college?
Okay, so what do special services mean in the context of colleges? Well, actually, before we go there, difference between 504 and IEP, I think, do we need to define those right now, Valerie, do you think?
Yeah, just one quick second, I think,
Okay.
just to clarify.
Yeah, so the biggest difference, and I think this is a really important difference, is that 504s are usually legal documents, and they follow the student from high school to college. IEPs are documents that are developed by the school system that are used in high school typically, or whatever the school is, and don't necessarily follow the student to college. There is a distinction there, and sometimes an IEP a college will look at the IEP and use it as a way to determine which accommodations might be needed or appropriate, but they do not have to use that document at all, and they may require the student to have other documentation along with it. Whereas a 504, they can see that very clearly, and they have to use that. So I think that's a really important part about how those two things are distinguished. As far as the specialized services in college, I guess maybe we can clear up, like, what do you mean by that, real fast before I go into that? Oh, you're on mute, Valerie.
I didn't know if the process was different in college than what these parents would be accustomed to dealing with in high school.
As far as making sure that those services are provided, you mean? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in high school, so they are going to be very different, right? The biggest difference is the student is now the one who's in charge. They're the ones who are initiating the contact. They're the ones who are following up on all of the contact. They're the ones who are making decisions about how much support or how little support they need. In most cases, outside people are not even allowed to play a role in it. When we work with students, we can do as much as we can up until the point where that student meets with the Office of Student Support Services. When they have that meeting, they don't let us in. We can't do anything. We can coach the student and help them learn how to advocate for themselves, but we can actually be in that meeting, so we don't know what's said other than what the student tells us. So it's really, really important for that student to kind of find their own voice and to understand what they need and why they need it. So finding those specialized supports is really becomes a responsibility of the student. And sometimes there's a lot to do for the student. It might be going to their therapist and making sure their therapist writes a letter, or their psychiatrist writing a letter, or whatever other players are, making sure that they can have all that support ready for them, because families and teachers and guidance counselors and administrators aren't doing anything at this point.
Right. So I want to turn, we have a lot of questions that have come in, so I want to make sure that we kind of pivot over to some of these questions. So one question that came in is, if current high school students already has an IEP for testing accommodations and some homework modifications and will need some level of support in college, is it fine to keep the IEP as is, or is it beneficial in some way to switch to a 504?
I think it's always beneficial to switch to a 504, mainly for the reason I gave before. It's a legal document, and it can be enforceable, right? Like it has teeth. When you bring that to the Office of Accommodations or the Student Service Office in college, that person will know exactly what the document is and what it means, and will be able to very clearly see exactly what needs to be done, and they can use that. They will have to use that as a part of creating those accommodations in college. They don't have to do the same thing with an IEP. Now, more often than not, they will. So I think that's important to let families know and parents know. More often than not, when you present an IEP to those offices and colleges, they'll use it as a reference point. But almost universally, they'll ask for supporting documentation.
And that would be like psychoeducational testing, or
Exactly.
something like that. Okay. And I think you may have answered this one, but before, does the student need to tell the college the exact disability they have in order to get college support, or is showing them the current IEP enough? In other words, is the college allowed to ask the student what his or her disability is?
So that goes back to the IEP sometimes not being enough documentation. And if an IEP is presented, they're going to ask for supporting documents. And more often than not, the supporting documents will need to include some sort of diagnosis. So oftentimes you need the extra stuff. The disclosure to that office is really important. I'm running through my mind real fast and trying to think if there's ever been a case where disclosure has not been made to that office. I don't think so. I think it's always made at least to that office. Again, I mean, that needs to be understood, that it's not being disclosed to the entire school. It's being disclosed to the office, and because of confidentiality reasons, they can't, spread that information around to anyone. That's obviously very private. And if parents are worried about that, they should understand that. When we're talking about accommodations and trying to get specific supports put in place, usually the more information that office has, the better, and the more robust accommodation support that they will receive.
So is it different? So I don't know if it's different for public and private school. I don't know that private schools require an IEP or 504. If your child is in a specialized private school, they probably don't have that, but they have the psychoeducational testing. How does that, do they have to get a 504 put in place for college? Like what, because they don't have a history of having one necessarily in that kind of environment.
Great question. And if they're in a private school, then I would recommend that they make sure that they contact the public school system, that they're obviously they're a part of that system somehow, and make sure that they get an IEP or 504 put in place. The private schools, you're right, don't have to do it. And they can choose how much they use it, but still make sure that process is started early. The earlier that can be done, the better off. Actually,
and the public school, even though this child is not in the public school still needs to work through that process with them if they are residents in that area.
Yes, exactly right.
Good to know. Other questions? Are there accommodations that are made specifically for anxiety and or depression? I'm particularly keen on individual academic coaching.
So that always depends on the specific student and what those needs are. So there's almost no accommodation that is like universal, right? So if a person has anxiety, there's no like one specific accommodation that is for anxiety. It's always individualized to that student. So if that student has social anxiety, right, and they have a really, really hard time taking tests or being under that kind of pressure cooker with a room full of other students, and they need a separate room, then the accommodation will hopefully be put in place so that student doesn't have to necessarily deal with that level of anxiety for that particular event. So I guess the answer is no. There's not like one. They're not like attached to any. No accommodation is attached to any diagnosis, for example. But there is a lot of overlap, and there are things that we commonly see, and the one for anxiety is what I just mentioned. Another one for maybe depression. I'll answer the academic coaching piece. If a student provides academic coaching as an accommodation, that is a wonderful, wonderful accommodation, and very rarely do I see that as something that the school will implement for that particular student, unless that student is a part of one of the schools that have really great like support systems or something else that you can put in place as a part of like the offerings of the school.
So one of the questions that we got that is pivot off of that is there somewhere that people can find the list of 24 colleges that you feel do a good job?
I don't have it public, but I'm certainly happy to maybe if somebody wants to send us their email and information, I'll certainly work with them and I'll get that information to them. Absolutely. But it's not like on my website or anything, no.
Right, got it. So we have another question. Can you please guide us to any particular websites that may give a list of colleges with comprehensive support or scaffolding? Unless working with a college finder company, it can be difficult to find these particular colleges.
Yeah, so I think when I'm talking to families and are just kind of looking for a like a high level understanding of what schools do a good job or maybe schools that aren't so great, there are like your typical college list websites that sometimes give you an idea of what's going on. All of those websites are, and I'm talking like the U.S. News, the Big Future. What are some other ones that I'm thinking of right now? I'm blanking as we're talking. Let's see if I can just pull up a quick list for college mental health resources. Oftentimes, SAMHSA has some information. That will be sometimes, actually most of the time, they get their information from students. They like interview students and families, and so sometimes it'll be good, sometimes it'll be not so great. um, the best way to do it is to like go into like the residential life or the student life and academic supports on the individual schools that you're looking for, um, and see if they have like alternative programs. They'll have funny acronyms like there was like the SALT program at University of Arizona or the PALS program. They have these like uh, various names that they like to give them, and usually you can find them that way. Where I would start, I started to say this and I got distracted. I'm sorry. Usually, if you go to bigfuture.com.org, I'm blanking on what it is right now. It's like a College Board, part of College Board. I think it's .org. That usually gives lots of families and students like a good jumping off point, right? It basically is every school in the country and even internationally, and allows you to kind of get a general understanding of what each school is all about. And we'll even list them in many ways. You can sort that. And then once you have that, you can kind of narrow down even a little bit further. The reality of it, unfortunately, is that unless you're working with someone who does know these schools intimately and is trained and understands kind of what's going on there, it's really hard to get to pull the information without doing a lot of legwork. So starting early is a really great way to do it. If you know your student's going to need these supports and is going to need an environment that is conducive to the way they learn and who they are, then don't waste any time. Start their sophomore year and start building an idea of what schools that might be appropriate for that student early on. I guess the reality of it is like the student normally is going to be the one who selects and chooses where they want to go. Not always, but most of the time you want to give them some of that autonomy, right? So if you can have a big list of, say, all right, so these are the ones I thought would be a good idea, and there's the big list for them to choose from, they're going to feel like they're more in control than if you say, all right, here's 3 schools and you need to choose between these 3. As a 17 or 18-year-old, my guess is maybe they're not going to like that so much.
Right. Having an almost 18-year-old, I can agree with that sentiment.
Yeah.
So I think this is sort of related. While in high school, would it help to hold an IEP meeting to have clear documentation of the diagnosis written into the IEP? And what other specific documentation do colleges need to have? I mean, we talked about the psychoeducational testing. What else do they need?
It is helpful to have it written into the IEP. I would start by saying that. And psychoeducational testing is always very, very helpful, from a mental health standpoint and from a learning standpoint. So because those two things are not separate by any stretch. So I would say that incorporating those 2 things are definitely have to be on the list. Having like specific information about like the style of learning that works best for that student is really, really helpful, especially if that's going to be used in college. Usually with an IEP, you don't have supporting documentation from therapists or psychiatrists, but having that on hand and making sure that whoever those practitioners or clinicians are, making sure that they know you may need that is going to be really, really important, I would say. Other than that, I'd say that's about it. Yeah.
But I'm assuming the answer is no to this question, but do students need to disclose at all that they are on medication or not?
No.
No. Okay. That can be kept entirely private and managed on their own.
Yep.
This is a little bit of a different question. What is the effect of faculty stress on students in college?
I guess I'd like to know a little more like what they mean by stress, faculty stress.
I mean, I'm assuming what that means is that, it's just been a stressful couple of years for everyone.
Okay.
And how much do the students pick up on the fact that, their faculty are human beings, right? Who have their own stresses and things in their lives that are kind of up. I mean, the sort of everyday life now has become so atypical.
Yeah.
that how is, and if your student is already predisposed to stress or anxiety, or just is hyper aware and sensitive to, people's emotions, how does that sort of affect students?
Um, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that question, but um, in my experience, the students who build relationships with their professors and know their professors well um, are much happier and much more successful in those classes, regardless of if that professor is stressed out or if is expressing some of that discomfort or that stress or the other aspects of life that happens. Um, the the correlation between student success and relationships that they have on positive supportive relationships with faculty and other adults on campus um, is really really high, and the more adult support and relationships that those students can build, the more likely they're gonna do well. So I don't know if that really, I kind of dodged the question. I hate to say it, but I think it's the reality is we know that stress rubs off on people we interact with, and as a student, if a professor was not behaving or not acting in a professional way or displaying that stress overtly, I think there are a number of problems with that, and the student hopefully would advocate to someone else, some other adult that they know, or family, and say, listen, something's not right here with this professor, and hopefully something could be changed about that. I would assume.
Just want to reiterate, just to clarify that the 504 is the legal document and the IEP is not necessarily. So if
Yes.
you don't have a 504, there's not really a legal recourse
Right.
if the school doesn't live up to its the obligations. Is that right? Or is
Well, so the distinction is, without the 504, almost universally the school is gonna require additional documentation from a therapist or from someone else. In the 504 follows the student to college, essentially. IEP will not necessarily. I mean, the student can literally bring like an IEP right to their meeting, right? But the school doesn't necessarily have to do anything with that. They can say, nope, we need your therapist to write a letter. We need the previous school to tell us what's going on. We need more documentation.
got it. What about students who have test anxiety, kind of like stage fright? Can something be written in to address that?
Um, so test anxiety is common, I would say, with lots of students that we work with. And as an accommodation, um, they can do whatever they can to help reduce that anxiety. But in my experience, it almost never just goes away, even with accommodations. So the best thing that can be done is, wellness and other strategies and supports that can be put in place outside of the test and outside of the classroom that can allow the student to kind of cope with that, and as much as they can in order to be effectively to effectively take those tests. The school will do whatever they hopefully will do whatever they can to have a separate room, or maybe allow the student to take the test, well, depending on the anxiety, earlier or later. Some students, I've seen it both ways, um, but to help that student kind of cope with that. But as we mentioned before, it's reasonable accommodations, right? So they're not just going to say, nope, you don't have to take any tests at all. Now, there are schools that don't have students take exams like that, though. So depending on the school that you go to, those tests and those exams and the way they determine how well a student is doing is different. So I think that plays a role in this too.
What and are those schools academically rigorous? Are they, like a school that doesn't test? Some parents might be like, "What's that about?"
It's a different type of school, absolutely. And I guess rigorous It depends. It depends on kind of your level. A lot of them are like the experiential learning type schools where they're learning by doing. And if they can pass it, although it might be a written exam, they might be passing an exam on how to perform whatever it is they're trying to perform. So I would say sometimes they're rigorous, sometimes maybe not.
Got it. And I think we have time for one more question. This is actually a really good one because we've just been assuming in this conversation that this is, that the students are going to matriculate to a four-year college. So how do you view community colleges as a first step toward four-year college enrollment in terms of resources available to special needs students who have emotional challenges?
There's two parts of that. The first part is I think community colleges are a great alternative and a great way to transition into a four-year school. It happens very often with students we work with, and it's a really good way for the student to figure out what the rigors and what college life is like in a relatively safe environment. To ease them into a school or a semester that has lots of different dates that they're dealing with, lots of different deadlines that they're dealing with, lots of different exam types, lots of different professors. Like that, it's a lot to figure out. And when you are required to take 12 to 18 credits, that can be overwhelming. So to be able to take a class or two classes or maybe three classes at a community college, just to kind of to test the waters, so to speak, that is really effective in helping a student determine what they want to do. Never mind, oftentimes students will change their major the first year, and or in an attempt to try to figure out what they want to do and what they want to major in. So community college, you can take some of the core classes that are going to be required, everywhere, and get those out of the way, while also kind of learning how college operates. So I think community college is actually a really great alternative for students and families who already know that this could be a really kind of strenuous transition. I'm blanking on the second part of that question. I know I shouldn't have divided it into two. What was the second part of it?
It was first steps toward college enrollment in terms of resources available to special needs students who have emotional challenges.
Community college, so the resources are going to be at least the same as other schools. They won't typically go beyond that. So, there are other four-year universities, public and private. They oftentimes have a lot of resources or specific separate programs that families and students can either purchase as part of their college package or whatever, or enroll in, that will provide additional supports. Community colleges won't necessarily have those additional supports, but they will definitely have the students' Office of Student Support or accommodations or disability services, however you want to call it, and they will be able to provide accommodations and do that. And depending on the community college, they may have some other stuff available. The other thing that they do have available is usually if a student is going to community college, they're staying local. So you have a lot of the other local mental health providers, you have family, you have the built-in environment that serves as a really important support piece that they might not get if they're traveling 200 miles or across the country.
Got it. All right, well, we are at time. If there are additional questions, feel free to reach out to us at info@ymhproject.org, and we can kind of pass them along. Gregg, thank you so much. I really appreciate your time. His organization, again, is RCHI Group, and they are an educational counseling organization that that focuses specifically on helping students with mental health challenges make a successful transition to college and finding the right fit for them. So thank you so much, Gregg. This was a fantastic conversation, and we'd love to have you back at some point.
Yeah, thank you for having me. This is great.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening.